The flames were already roaring. A massive furnace stood in the center of the Babylonian plain, its mouth glowing like the heart of a volcano. Heat rippled through the air so intensely that even the soldiers standing several steps away shielded their faces. The fire had been burning all day. Wood, oil, pitch, more wood, more oil. King Nebuchadnezzar had given a very clear order. Make the furnace hotter than it had ever been before. And the king's servants obeyed. The furnace roared louder and louder, flames twisting upward into the sky, like living creatures hungry for destruction. Even from far away, the people gathered on the plain could feel the heat pressing against their skin. Thousands of them had been forced to gather there that day: governors, officials, soldiers, priests, merchants, and nobles from every corner of the Babylonian Empire. All of them stood facing a towering object in the distance. A statue made entirely of gold. It rose nearly 100 feet into the air, shining so brightly under the sun that people had to squint their eyes just to look at it. The statue reflected light in every direction, a monument meant to display the king's power and glory. And everyone had been given a command. When the music played, they were to bow. Every person, every nation, every ruler, every servant, every man and woman in the entire empire. Because the king had declared something terrifying. Whoever refused to bow before the golden image would be thrown into the furnace of blazing fire. No trial, no debate, no mercy, just fire. At first, the crowd had obeyed immediately. When the horns sounded and the music filled the air, thousands of people fell to their knees at once. From a distance, it looked like waves rolling across the ground as bodies bent down in fear. But something strange had happened. 3 men did not bow. They stood while everyone else knelt. They did not move. They did not bend. They did not pretend. In the middle of a sea of kneeling people, 3 figures remained standing. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were young men from the land of Judah, captives, foreigners, servants inside the Babylonian Empire. Yet somehow, they stood taller than kings. They had been warned. They had been threatened. They had been given a second chance. Still, they refused to bow. Now the punishment was waiting. The furnace. Guards grabbed the 3 men and tied them tightly with thick ropes. Their robes were still on them, their turbans still on their heads. There was no time for preparation. King Nebuchadnezzar's anger had reached its peak. His face burned with rage as he shouted the command. Throw them into the fire. The soldiers dragged the men toward the furnace opening. The heat grew more unbearable with every step. Flames burst out from the entrance like an explosion. The air itself seemed to burn. Some people in the crowd turned their heads away, unable to watch what was about to happen. Others stared in silence. What kind of faith could make someone walk towards certain death without fear? But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not struggle. They did not beg. They did not cry. Moments earlier, they had spoken words that shocked the king himself. They had said, "Our God is able to deliver us from the blazing furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand." Then they said something even more powerful. "But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." The soldiers reached the furnace. The heat was now unbearable. Flames blasted out of the opening with such force that the men holding the prisoners could barely stand upright. Yet the command had been given, and Babylon's soldiers obeyed. With one final shove, they threw the 3 men into the fire. For a moment, the flames swallowed them completely. The furnace roared louder than ever. The heat was so intense that the soldiers who had thrown them inside collapsed instantly, overcome by the blazing fire. The crowd gasped. Surely no one could survive that. No human body could endure flames like that. No man could walk out alive. But something strange began to happen. Inside the furnace, shapes began to move. At first, the king thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He leaned forward, staring into the fire. His face changed. His anger disappeared. Now his expression showed something else. Shock. He turned quickly to the officials standing beside him and asked a question that no one expected. "Did we not throw 3 men into the fire?" The officials nodded. "Yes, your majesty." The king looked back into the flames again. His voice trembled. "Look, I see 4 men walking in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And the 4th looks like a son of the gods." The furnace was still roaring. The flames were still burning. But inside the fire, 4 figures were walking, alive, Long before the flames rose into the sky, before the furnace roared with deadly heat, before three men stood in defiance before an entire empire, there was a king. His name was Nebuchadnezzar, and in his mind, no king had ever been greater. Nebuchadnezzar ruled over Babylon, the most powerful empire the world had seen in generations. His armies had conquered nations across vast lands. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen beneath the strength of Babylon's soldiers. Cities burned, walls collapsed, kings surrendered, and the treasures of those conquered lands were carried back to Babylon. Soon the capital city became the pride of the world. Its walls were massive, so thick that chariots could ride along the top. Its gates were decorated with shining blue tiles and golden carvings of lions and dragons. Temples rose high into the sky, and gardens filled with exotic plants and flowing water amazed every visitor who entered the city. Babylon was a place of glory, a place of wealth, a place of overwhelming power. And at the center of it all stood Nebuchadnezzar. He had built this empire. He had conquered these lands. He had become the ruler of nations. But with power often comes something dangerous: pride. The king began to believe that his greatness was something more than human. He believed he deserved not only obedience, but worship. Not long before the events at the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar had experienced a troubling dream, one that none of his wise men could understand. It was a dream about a great statue made of different materials, representing kingdoms that would rise and fall throughout history. Only one man in Babylon had been able to explain the dream, a young Hebrew man named Daniel. Daniel had revealed that Nebuchadnezzar himself was the head of gold in the statue, a symbol of Babylon's power and authority. The dream had shown that kingdoms would come after him, but none would take away the glory of his current reign. At first, the king had been amazed. He had even praised the God of Daniel. But something strange happened afterward. Instead of becoming humble, Nebuchadnezzar became even more proud. The dream had spoken of a statue with many materials: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. But the king had an idea. What if he built a statue made entirely of gold? Not just a head of gold, the entire statue. A monument that would declare one powerful message to the entire empire: Babylon will never fall, and the king who rules it deserves to be honored above all. So Nebuchadnezzar gave the command. Craftsmen from across the empire were gathered together. Metalworkers, builders, and artists labored day and night to create something the world had never seen before. When they were finished, the statue towered above the plain of Dura. It stood nearly 90 feet tall. Its golden surface reflected the sunlight so brightly that it could be seen from miles away. Every detail had been polished until it gleamed like fire under the desert sky. It was magnificent. It was overwhelming. It was impossible to ignore. Then the king sent messengers across his empire. Every governor, every judge, every ruler, every official, every leader from every province was commanded to gather at the plain of Dura. The day of dedication had come. The plain slowly filled with people from many nations and languages. Babylon's empire was vast, and representatives from all its territories now stood together before the giant statue. Soldiers guarded the area. Officials organized the ceremony. Musicians prepared their instruments. Everyone waited for the king. When Nebuchadnezzar finally arrived, the crowd grew silent. He looked out across the thousands gathered before him. This moment was not simply about a statue. It was about loyalty, about control, about power. Then a herald stepped forward and shouted with a loud voice so that everyone could hear the king's command. People of every nation and language, this is what you are commanded to do. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The crowd listened carefully, but the herald was not finished. His voice grew louder as he announced the punishment. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. A murmur spread through the crowd. No one doubted the king's power. No one doubted his ability to carry out such a threat. Babylon's kings were known for their ruthless justice, and standing not far from the statue was proof of that threat. A giant furnace had been built. Its flames were already burning. Smoke rose into the sky. The message was clear: bow or burn. For most people in the crowd, the choice was easy. They had their families to think about, their lives, their homes, their positions in the empire. What was one simple act of bowing? What did it matter if they knelt for a moment before a statue? The music began to play. The horns sounded first, echoing across the plain. Then the flutes joined in. Harps and lyres followed, filling the air with music. And almost instantly, thousands of people fell to their knees. Governors bowed. Officials bowed. Soldiers bowed. Merchants bowed. The entire crowd moved like a great wave sweeping across the ground. Everyone bowed. Or at least, almost everyone. Because in the middle of that sea of kneeling bodies, 3 men remained standing. And their choice was about to change everything. Long before the flames rose into the sky, before the furnace roared with deadly heat, before 3 men stood in defiance before an entire empire, there was a king. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. And in his mind, no king had ever been greater. Nebuchadnezzar ruled over Babylon, the most powerful empire the world had seen in generations. His armies had conquered nations across vast lands. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen beneath the strength of Babylon's soldiers. Cities burned. Walls collapsed. Kings surrendered. And the treasures of those conquered lands were carried back to Babylon. Soon the capital city became the pride of the world. Its walls were massive, so thick that chariots could ride along the top. Its gates were decorated with shining blue tiles and golden carvings of lions and dragons. Temples rose high into the sky, and gardens filled with exotic plants and flowing water amazed every visitor who entered the city. Babylon was a place of glory, a place of wealth, a place of overwhelming power. And at the center of it all stood Nebuchadnezzar. He had built this empire. He had conquered these lands. He had become the ruler of nations. But with power often comes something dangerous: pride. The king began to believe that his greatness was something more than human. He believed he deserved not only obedience, but worship. Not long before the events at the fiery furnace, Nebuchadnezzar had experienced a troubling dream, one that none of his wise men could understand. It was a dream about a great statue made of different materials, representing kingdoms that would rise and fall throughout history. Only one man in Babylon had been able to explain the dream, a young Hebrew man named Daniel. Daniel had revealed that Nebuchadnezzar himself was the head of gold in the statue, a symbol of Babylon's power and authority. The dream had shown that kingdoms would come after him, but none would take away the glory of his current reign. At first, the king had been amazed. He had even praised the God of Daniel. But something strange happened afterward. Instead of becoming humble, Nebuchadnezzar became even more proud. The dream had spoken of a statue with many materials: gold, silver, bronze, and iron. But the king had an idea. What if he built a statue made entirely of gold? Not just a head of gold. The entire statue. A monument that would declare one powerful message to the entire empire: Babylon will never fall, and the king who rules it deserves to be honored above all. So Nebuchadnezzar gave the command. Craftsmen from across the empire were gathered together. Metalworkers, builders, and artists labored day and night to create something the world had never seen before. When they were finished, the statue towered above the plain of Dura. It stood nearly 90 feet tall. Its golden surface reflected the sunlight so brightly that it could be seen from miles away. Every detail had been polished until it gleamed like fire under the desert sky. It was magnificent. It was overwhelming. It was impossible to ignore. Then the king sent messengers across his empire. Every governor, every judge, every ruler, every official, every leader from every province was commanded to gather at the plain of Dura. The day of dedication had come. The plain slowly filled with people from many nations and languages. Babylon's empire was vast, and representatives from all its territories now stood together before the giant statue. Soldiers guarded the area. Officials organized the ceremony. Musicians prepared their instruments. Everyone waited for the king. When Nebuchadnezzar finally arrived, the crowd grew silent. He looked out across the thousands gathered before him. This moment was not simply about a statue. It was about loyalty, about control, about power. Then a herald stepped forward and shouted with a loud voice so that everyone could hear the king's command. People of every nation and language, this is what you are commanded to do. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. The crowd listened carefully, but the herald was not finished. His voice grew louder as he announced the punishment. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. A murmur spread through the crowd. No one doubted the king's power. No one doubted his ability to carry out such a threat. Babylon's kings were known for their ruthless justice, and standing not far from the statue was proof of that threat. A giant furnace had been built. Its flames were already burning. Smoke rose into the sky. The message was clear: bow or burn. For most people in the crowd, the choice was easy. They had their families to think about, their lives, their homes, their positions in the empire. What was one simple act of bowing? What did it matter if they knelt for a moment before a statue? The music began to play. The horns sounded first, echoing across the plain. Then the flutes joined in. Harps and lyres followed, filling the air with music. And almost instantly, thousands of people fell to their knees. Governors bowed. Officials bowed. Soldiers bowed. Merchants bowed. The entire crowd moved like a great wave sweeping across the ground. Everyone bowed. Or at least, almost everyone. Because in the middle of that sea of kneeling bodies, 3 men remained standing. And their choice was about to change everything. The music slowly faded. One by one, the instruments fell silent. The final notes of the horns drifted away into the hot Babylonian air, and the crowd on the plain of Dura began to rise from the ground. Thousands of people stood up again after bowing before the golden statue. Dust clung to their robes. Sweat glistened on their faces under the burning sun. Most of them were relieved. They had done what the king commanded. They had bowed. They had survived. But not everyone had been focused on the music. A small group of Babylonian officials had been watching something else entirely. They had been watching 3 men. 3 men who had not bowed. Those men were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The officials had seen them clearly. While thousands knelt, these 3 had remained standing. While the empire obeyed, they had refused. The officials exchanged quiet looks. This was the opportunity they had been waiting for. For years, many of the Babylonian leaders had been jealous of these young men from Judah. They were foreigners, captives from a conquered nation. And yet somehow they had risen to positions of influence inside the government of Babylon. It had all begun years earlier when their friend Daniel had interpreted the troubling dream of King Nebuchadnezzar. Because of that moment, Daniel had been elevated to a high position in the kingdom. And Daniel had asked the king to appoint his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to important administrative roles in the province of Babylon. From that day forward, the 3 men had served faithfully. They managed affairs. They governed regions. They carried out the king's commands. They worked diligently and honestly. And that made some people hate them even more. Jealousy had grown quietly among certain Babylonian leaders. They wanted those positions. They wanted that power. But until now, they had never found a reason to accuse the 3 men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had done their work well. They had followed the laws of the empire. They had respected the king. There had been nothing to accuse them of. Until today. Now the officials hurried toward the king with excitement hidden behind respectful expressions. Nebuchadnezzar was still standing near the great golden statue, watching the ceremony unfold. When the officials approached, they bowed deeply before him. "O king, live forever," they said. The king nodded slightly, acknowledging their greeting. One of the officials spoke carefully, choosing his words with precision. "Your Majesty issued a decree," he said. "You commanded that when the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and all kinds of music is heard, everyone must fall down and worship the golden image." Nebuchadnezzar's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes," he said, "that is correct." The official continued, "And whoever does not fall down and worship must be thrown into the blazing furnace." The king nodded again. "Yes." But the official was not finished. "There are some men," he paused for effect, "whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. Men from Judah." Now the king's attention sharpened. The official spoke their names slowly. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The officials bowed slightly again before delivering their accusation. "These men pay no attention to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they refuse to worship the golden image you have set up." For a moment, the air seemed to freeze. The king's face changed instantly. His calm expression disappeared. Rage replaced it. Nebuchadnezzar was not a man who tolerated disobedience. His authority had built an empire. His commands had shaped nations. And now 3 men, 3 captives from a conquered land, had publicly ignored his decree. The king's voice thundered across the plain. "Bring them to me." Soldiers immediately moved through the crowd and seized the three men. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were brought before the king. The massive golden statue towered behind them, shining in the sunlight. Thousands of people watched in silence. The king stared at the three men with burning anger. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?" The three men stood calmly before him. They did not tremble. They did not lower their heads. They simply listened. The king leaned forward. Despite his anger, he decided to give them one more chance. "Now when you hear the sound of the music again," he said, "if you fall down and worship the image I made, that will be good." His voice hardened. "But if you do not worship it, you will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace." The king spread his arms toward the roaring furnace nearby. "Then what god will be able to rescue you from my hand?" The crowd waited. Everyone expected the same thing. Surely the three men would bow now. Surely they would apologize. Surely they would do whatever it took to save their lives. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did something unexpected. They answered the king calmly, respectfully, but firmly. "O Nebuchadnezzar," they said, "we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter." The crowd murmured quietly. No one spoke to the king like that. But the three men continued. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." The king's jaw tightened, but the men were not finished. Then they said words that echoed with unshakable faith. "But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden image you have set up." Silence fell across the entire plain. Thousands of people stood frozen. The three men had just declared their loyalty to God in front of the most powerful king on earth, and they had done it knowing it might cost them their lives. Nebuchadnezzar's face turned red with fury. The king who had conquered nations now faced something he could not control. Faith. And that faith made him furious. He shouted orders to his soldiers. "Heat the furnace 7 times hotter than usual." The punishment would be unforgettable. The fire would be unstoppable. And the entire empire would watch what happened to anyone who dared defy the king of Babylon. The moment the words left their mouths, the atmosphere on the plain changed completely. The crowd had been silent before. Now the silence felt heavy, dangerous. Thousands of people stood frozen where they were, hardly daring to breathe, as the three men stood boldly before the most powerful ruler in the world. Their answer had been calm, respectful, but it had also been unbreakable. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had not insulted the king. They had not shouted. They had not argued. They had simply made something clear. Their loyalty belonged to their God alone. And no command from a human king could change that. But for King Nebuchadnezzar, those words felt like open rebellion. His pride had been wounded. In front of thousands of officials and leaders from across the empire, three men had refused him. The king's face twisted with rage. His eyes burned with fury as he stared at the three men standing before him. Nebuchadnezzar had crushed armies. He had destroyed cities. He had humbled kings. No one spoke to him this way. No one defied him publicly. But these three men, foreigners from the conquered land of Judah, had dared to say something that struck directly at his authority. They had said that their God could rescue them from his power. And worse still, they had declared that even if their God chose not to rescue them, they still would not bow. The king's pride could not tolerate such defiance. His voice exploded across the plain. "Enough!" The word echoed like thunder. Everyone nearby flinched. Nebuchadnezzar pointed angrily toward the blazing furnace that stood near the golden statue. "Heat the furnace." But then he added something even more terrifying. "Heat it 7 times hotter than usual." Gasps spread quietly through the crowd. 7 times hotter? The furnace was already blazing fiercely. The flames already roared high above its opening. But the king wanted something more than punishment. He wanted an example. He wanted the entire empire to see what happened to those who defied his command. Soldiers rushed to obey. Servants hurried to feed more fuel into the furnace. Wood, pitch, oil, everything they could find. The flames grew stronger with every passing moment. Soon the fire roared louder than before, and waves of heat rolled outward across the plain. Even standing far away, people could feel the scorching air pressing against their skin. Smoke curled upward in thick, dark spirals. The furnace began to glow brighter and brighter. The king turned again to his soldiers. "Bring the strongest men in the army," he commanded. A group of Babylon's most powerful warriors stepped forward. They were tall, armored, and battle-hardened soldiers who had fought in the king's greatest victories. They feared no enemy. They feared no battlefield. But even they looked uneasy as they glanced toward the blazing furnace. The king pointed toward the 3 prisoners. "Bind them." The soldiers moved quickly. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not resist as ropes were tied tightly around them. Their hands were bound. Their arms were secured. Their robes and turbans remained on them exactly as they were. There would be no preparation, no delay. The king wanted them thrown into the fire immediately. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Some people looked away. Others stared with wide eyes. It was one thing to hear a threat. It was another to watch the punishment unfold. Yet even as the soldiers bound them, the 3 men showed no panic, no fear, no desperate pleading. Their faces remained calm. Perhaps their hearts beat faster. Perhaps they felt the heat of the flames growing stronger nearby. But something deeper than fear filled their minds. Faith. They believed in the God they served. The God who had delivered their people before. The God who had performed miracles in the past. They knew he had the power to save them. But even if he did not, their decision would not change. They would not bow. The soldiers finished tying the ropes. The 3 men were now prisoners awaiting execution. The king raised his hand once more. "Take them." The soldiers grabbed the bound men and began dragging them toward the furnace. The closer they moved, the more unbearable the heat became. The flames roared like a wild storm. Air shimmered above the furnace opening. The metal structure glowed bright red from the intense heat inside. People standing nearby backed away, unable to tolerate the scorching air. The soldiers struggled to continue forward. Still, the king watched with satisfaction. Let the entire empire see this moment. Let everyone understand what happens when someone refuses to obey the king of Babylon. The soldiers reached the edge of the furnace. The flames burst outward violently. The heat was overwhelming. But the command had been given, and Babylon's soldiers obeyed. With one final effort, they prepared to throw the 3 men into the blazing fire. The furnace roared louder than ever before. And within seconds, everything would change. The flames roared like a raging storm. The furnace stood like a giant mouth of fire in the middle of the plain of Dura, glowing brighter than ever before. Thick smoke spiraled upward into the sky, darkening the air above the gathering. Servants and soldiers continued feeding the fire with more fuel, wood, oil, pitch, anything that would burn. The command of King Nebuchadnezzar had been clear. Make it hotter, 7 times hotter. Soon the flames grew so fierce that the furnace glowed like molten metal. The heat pouring from its opening felt like standing beside a volcano ready to erupt. People in the crowd began stepping backward instinctively, trying to escape the burning waves of air. Even the soldiers standing closest shielded their faces with their arms. But the king did not move. Nebuchadnezzar stood watching. His expression was cold. This moment was meant to be remembered. He wanted every ruler, every governor, every official gathered from across Babylon to witness the consequences of defying his authority. The 3 men stood bound nearby. Their names were known throughout the empire now. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They were once respected administrators in the province of Babylon, trusted officials, faithful workers within the king's government. But today they were something else. Prisoners, condemned men. The ropes binding their arms were tight, and their robes hung loosely around them as soldiers prepared to carry out the king's command. Yet something about the 3 men puzzled those watching them. They did not look terrified. They did not struggle against the ropes. They did not shout for mercy. Instead, they seemed strangely calm, almost peaceful. Some in the crowd whispered quietly, "How could anyone remain so calm when facing such a death?" Perhaps they truly believed their God would rescue them. Perhaps they were simply brave. Or perhaps they had accepted their fate. Whatever the reason, their courage stood in sharp contrast to the fear spreading through the crowd. The furnace continued roaring louder. The air shimmered with heat. The soldiers assigned to carry out the execution stepped forward. These were not ordinary guards. They were some of the strongest warriors in Babylon's army, men who had fought in battles across distant lands. Their armor gleamed under the harsh sunlight, and their heavy boots crushed the dust beneath their feet as they approached the prisoners. Even they hesitated when they felt the furnace's intense heat. But the command had come from the king himself. They could not refuse. The soldiers grabbed the bound men roughly. "Move," one of them shouted. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were forced forward toward the furnace. With every step, the heat grew more unbearable. Flames burst from the furnace opening like waves crashing against the shore. The soldiers could barely see through the thick smoke and blazing light. People standing nearby turned their heads away. Some covered their faces. Others stared with horrified fascination. It was not every day that someone was executed in such a terrifying way. The soldiers reached the edge of the furnace. The opening blazed with unbearable brightness. The heat was so intense that it felt like the air itself was on fire. Still the soldiers obeyed. With all their strength, they lifted the 3 bound men. For a moment, the figures of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were silhouetted against the roaring flames. The fire crackled violently. The soldiers took one final step forward. And then, they threw the 3 men into the furnace. What happened next shocked everyone watching. The heat of the fire was so intense that the soldiers themselves collapsed instantly. The flames burst outward from the furnace with deadly force. The warriors who had thrown the men inside were struck by the scorching heat and fell to the ground, overcome by the fire they had approached. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The soldiers had died, killed by the very flames meant for the prisoners. People stared in horror. If the fire was powerful enough to kill strong warriors standing outside the furnace, then surely no one inside could survive. Inside the furnace, the flames raged wildly. The fire roared like a beast unleashed. The bound bodies of the 3 men disappeared into the blazing inferno. From the outside, nothing could be seen except swirling fire. The furnace crackled and thundered. The execution seemed complete. For a moment, silence spread across the plain. Some people lowered their heads. Others whispered quietly among themselves. It was over. 3 men had defied the king. 3 men had been destroyed. But then something strange began to happen. Someone near the king noticed movement inside the furnace. At first, they assumed it was simply the shifting flames. But then the king himself leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. Nebuchadnezzar stared into the blazing opening. Something about what he saw made him suddenly stand up. His face changed. The anger that had filled it moments earlier vanished. Now there was something else in his expression. Confusion, shock, disbelief. The king took a step closer. He continued staring into the fire. The officials beside him noticed the change in his face. "What is it, Your Majesty?" one of them asked nervously. The king did not answer right away. He kept staring into the furnace as though trying to understand something impossible. Finally he spoke, but his voice sounded very different from before. "Wait." He turned toward the officials standing beside him. "Did we not throw 3 men into the fire?" The officials looked at one another briefly. Then they nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty," they answered. 3 men. But the king pointed toward the furnace. His voice rose in astonishment. "Look, I see 4 men walking in the fire." The officials rushed forward to see for themselves. The flames still roared violently inside the furnace. But through the blazing light, shapes were moving. Not 3, 4. And something even stranger was happening. The men were not burning. Their ropes had disappeared. Their bodies were unharmed. They were walking calmly inside the furnace as though the flames had no power over them. And the fourth figure looked different. Radiant. Majestic. The king stared in amazement. The fourth looks like a son of the gods. The fire that should have destroyed them had become the stage for a miracle. The flames inside the furnace continued to roar with unstoppable power. The fire had not grown weaker. It had not slowed. If anything, it seemed even more violent than before. The blazing heat surged upward in waves, twisting and swirling like a living storm of fire. From the outside, the furnace looked like certain death. Yet inside, something impossible was happening. King Nebuchadnezzar could not believe what he was seeing. His eyes remained fixed on the furnace opening. Moments earlier, he had expected to see nothing but destruction. Ashes, smoke, perhaps the fading shadows of bodies consumed by flame. But instead, he saw movement. Clear movement. For figures were walking inside the furnace. Walking. Not screaming. Not collapsing. Not burning. Walking calmly, as if the flames were nothing more than gentle light. The king stepped forward again, leaning closer as if he needed to see it from a different angle. The officials beside him exchanged nervous glances. One of them whispered quietly, What does the king see? But soon they saw it too. The figures inside the fire were clearly visible now. 3 of them were the prisoners thrown in moments earlier. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. There was no mistake. Their robes were still on them. Their turbans still rested on their heads. Their bodies moved freely. The ropes that had bound them were gone, burned away by the flames. Yet the fire had not touched them. Not their skin, not their clothing, not even their hair. And they were not alone. A 4th figure walked beside them. This figure moved with quiet authority. The blazing furnace illuminated him in a way that made him appear almost radiant. The flames did not harm him either. Instead, they seemed to surround him like light. The king's voice trembled with astonishment. Look, he pointed toward the furnace again. Do you see it? There are 4 men walking in the fire, and none of them are hurt. The officials stared with wide eyes. They had witnessed battles. They had seen great armies clash and kingdoms fall, but none of them had ever seen anything like this. A furnace hot enough to kill soldiers instantly, and yet 4 men walked peacefully inside it. One of the advisors spoke quietly. Your Majesty, it is a miracle. Nebuchadnezzar continued staring into the fire. His anger had vanished completely. Now his face showed only wonder and fear. The king had believed himself to be the most powerful ruler on earth. His command had forced thousands of people to bow before a golden statue. His authority had sentenced 3 men to death without hesitation. Yet now he was witnessing something that reminded him of a greater power. A power beyond kings, beyond empires, beyond the reach of any human command. Inside the furnace, the 3 men walked calmly beside the mysterious 4th figure. The flames twisted around them like waves, but none of them seemed troubled by the fire. It was as though an invisible barrier protected them. The furnace had become a place of safety. Outside, the crowd had grown restless. People were whispering to one another. Some were trying to see what the king had seen. Others simply sensed that something extraordinary was happening. Finally, Nebuchadnezzar could not remain silent any longer. He stepped closer to the furnace opening. The heat was still overwhelming. Even standing several steps away felt dangerous. But the king raised his voice and shouted into the roaring flames. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. His words echoed across the plain. Everyone fell silent again. The king continued. Servants of the Most High God. The title surprised many people standing nearby. Only moments earlier he had demanded their execution. Now he spoke to them with respect. Come out. Come here. The crowd waited. The furnace continued roaring. For a brief moment, nothing seemed to change. Then something incredible happened. 3 figures began walking toward the opening of the furnace. Through the blazing flames they moved calmly, step by step. The fire parted around them, and one by one, they stepped out of the furnace. The moment they emerged, the officials rushed forward in amazement. Governors, advisors, judges, treasurers, all of them gathered around the 3 men who should have been dead. They examined them closely, looking for burns, looking for wounds, looking for any sign that the fire had touched them. But there was none. Their robes were untouched. Their hair was not singed. Their skin showed no injury. Even more astonishing, there was no smell of smoke on them. It was as if the furnace had never touched them at all. The crowd erupted into stunned whispers. How is this possible? They were inside the fire. The soldiers died just standing near it. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood calmly among them. They looked exactly the same as they had before the execution. The miracle was undeniable. Nebuchadnezzar stared at them in awe. He had watched them enter the furnace. He had seen the fire raging at full strength. And yet they now stood before him alive, completely unharmed. Slowly, the king lifted his voice so everyone could hear. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The crowd fell silent again. The ruler of Babylon continued speaking. He has sent his messenger and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, and they defied the king's command rather than serve or worship any god except their own. His voice carried across the entire plain. For the second time that day, everyone was listening to the king. But this time, his message was very different. The furnace that was meant to destroy faith had revealed the power of the true God, and the miracle was not finished yet. The plain of Dura had never been so silent. Only moments earlier, the crowd had watched what they believed would be a terrible execution. The furnace had roared like a monster, flames climbing high into the sky, heat pulsing across the ground. Now those same flames still burned behind them. But the three men who had been thrown into that fire stood alive before everyone, unharmed, untouched. Even their clothing looked exactly the same as before. People whispered nervously, still struggling to understand what they had witnessed. Governors and officials circled around the three men, examining them closely. One man leaned forward and inspected the sleeves of Shadrach. Another looked carefully at the hair of Meshach. A third checked the robe of Abednego. They searched for burns, for ashes, for any sign that the flames had touched them. But they found nothing. Not even the smell of smoke clung to their clothes. It was impossible. The soldiers who had thrown them into the furnace had died instantly from the heat. Yet the three prisoners had walked through the fire and returned unharmed. The miracle could not be denied. At the center of the gathering stood King Nebuchadnezzar. The powerful ruler of Babylon looked very different now than he had earlier that day. The pride and anger that had filled his face before were gone. Now his expression carried something far deeper. Awe, fear, respect. For the first time, the king realized that the God these men served was unlike any god he had known. Nebuchadnezzar slowly stepped forward. The crowd moved aside to let him pass. He approached the three men who had survived the furnace. Everyone waited to hear what the king would say next. Would he punish them again? Would he demand another test? Or would he finally acknowledge the power that had rescued them? The king lifted his voice so that all the officials and leaders gathered from across the empire could hear him. Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The words spread through the crowd like a shockwave. Only hours earlier the king had demanded that everyone bow before a golden statue. Now he was publicly honoring the God of the very men he had condemned. Nebuchadnezzar continued speaking. He has sent his messenger and rescued his servants. They trusted in him, and they were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. The crowd listened carefully. Some nodded slowly. Others stared at the three men with new respect. Their courage had changed the course of the entire moment. These men had faced death without fear. They had refused to compromise their faith. And now everyone had witnessed the result. The king raised his hand again, signaling that he had more to say. His voice grew stronger. Therefore I decree. Whenever the king announced a decree, it meant a new law for the entire empire. Every governor, official, and leader present leaned forward to listen carefully. The king's words would shape the future of the kingdom. Any people, nation, or language that says anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses turned into piles of rubble. Gasps spread quietly among the crowd. The king's decrees were never gentle. But this message was clear. No one in the empire was allowed to disrespect the God who had just performed this miracle. Nebuchadnezzar finished his proclamation with powerful words. For no other God can save in this way. Those words echoed across the plain. The rulers of provinces, the governors, the judges, the advisors, all of them had seen the miracle with their own eyes. They could not argue with what they had witnessed. The furnace had been real. The flames had been deadly. Yet these three men had survived because of their faith. And now the king himself was declaring that their God had power beyond any other. After a moment of silence, Nebuchadnezzar turned toward the three men again. His voice softened slightly. There is more. The crowd watched closely. The king continued. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be promoted in the province of Babylon. Another ripple of surprise moved through the officials. These men had just faced execution. Now they were being elevated even higher in the king's government. Their faith had not destroyed their future. It had strengthened it. The three men bowed respectfully before the king. But they did not boast. They did not act proud. Their faces remained calm and humble. Because they knew the truth. Their rescue had not come from their own strength. It had come from the God they trusted. Far away from the furnace, the great golden statue still stood tall under the sun. But something had changed that day. The statue had demanded worship. The furnace had demanded fear. Yet neither had defeated the faith of three men who trusted God more than the power of a king. The story of that miracle would travel far beyond the plain of Dura, across the cities of Babylon, across distant lands ruled by the empire. People would tell the story again and again. The story of three men who refused to bow. The story of a furnace that could not destroy them. And the story of the mysterious fourth figure who walked with them in the fire. Because sometimes the greatest miracles do not happen when people avoid the fire. Sometimes they happen when God walks with them through it. The flames of the furnace eventually faded. The smoke that once filled the sky above the plain of Dura slowly drifted away with the wind. The crowd began to disperse. Officials returned to their provinces. Governors traveled back to their cities. But none of them left unchanged. Because what they had witnessed that day was more than a miracle. It was a moment that forced everyone to confront a powerful truth. Faith cannot always avoid the fire. Sometimes faith walks straight into it. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not begin with the furnace. It began with a decision. A quiet but powerful decision made long before the flames ever appeared. They had decided that their faith would not depend on comfort. They had decided that their loyalty to God would not change when pressure came. And when the moment arrived, when the music played and thousands of people bowed before the golden statue, they stood. Not because they were stronger than everyone else. Not because they were fearless, but because they believed something greater than fear. They believed in the living God. The moment they refused to bow, their fate seemed sealed. The anger of King Nebuchadnezzar had been overwhelming. The furnace had been heated 7 times hotter. The punishment had looked certain. Yet the most powerful moment of their faith came not when they were rescued, but when they said something extraordinary before entering the fire. Our God is able to deliver us from the furnace. But even if he does not, we will not serve your gods. Those words carried a faith deeper than any miracle. Because true faith does not only trust God when rescue is guaranteed. True faith trusts God even when the outcome is uncertain. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were ready to die rather than betray their faith. And that is exactly why their story has been remembered for thousands of years. Because courage like that cannot be destroyed by fire. When the furnace doors opened and the flames roared, it looked like the end. The soldiers who threw them inside collapsed instantly from the heat. Anyone watching would have believed that the 3 men were gone forever. But something extraordinary happened inside the fire. They were not alone. A 4th figure appeared beside them. A mysterious presence walking calmly through the flames. Even Nebuchadnezzar himself recognized that the 4th figure was unlike anyone else. The 4th looks like a son of the gods. Throughout history, many people have wondered about that moment. Who was the 4th figure? Why did the fire lose its power? Why did the flames burn the ropes, but not the men? The answer points to a truth that runs through the entire story. God did not simply rescue them from the fire. He walked with them inside it. Sometimes people imagine faith as a shield that prevents all hardship. But the story of the fiery furnace tells a different message. Faith does not always remove the trial. Sometimes it transforms the trial. The furnace that was meant to destroy them became the place where God revealed his power. The fire that was meant to silence their faith became the moment that displayed it to an entire empire. And the king who had demanded worship for a golden statue ended up praising the God he once ignored. That is the power of unshakable faith. It changes more than just the lives of those who believe. It changes the hearts of those who witness it. The decree of Nebuchadnezzar spread throughout Babylon. He announced that no one could speak against the God who had saved these men. But the real impact of that moment went far beyond a royal decree. The leaders who stood on the plain of Dura carried the story back to their people. They told the story of a furnace hotter than any fire they had seen. They told the story of 3 men who refused to bow. And they told the story of a 4th figure walking in the flames. Generation after generation would repeat that story, because it revealed something powerful about faith. Faith does not mean life will always be easy. Faith does not promise that the furnace will never come. But faith does promise something greater. You will not face the fire alone. Even today, people face their own furnaces. Moments of pressure. Moments when doing what is right feels costly. Moments when standing firm feels lonely. In those moments, the story of the fiery furnace still speaks. It reminds us that courage often begins with a simple decision. The decision to stand, even if others bow. The decision to trust, even if the outcome is unknown. And sometimes, when the flames rise and the situation feels impossible, that is exactly when the presence of God becomes most visible. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is not just about survival. It is about unwavering faith. A faith that stands when the world bows. A faith that refuses compromise. A faith strong enough to walk through fire. And when faith like that appears, even kings begin to notice. Because there is no power greater than a faith that refuses to bow.